On the afternoon of May 14, 1948, a small, stocky man with a wild crown of white hair stood at a podium in a museum hall in Tel Aviv and read 37 words that changed the map of the world. The hall was packed. Outside, in the streets, thousands of people had been gathering since morning. Some of them had walked for miles. Some of them had come from the displaced persons camps of post-Holocaust Europe, survivors who had crossed oceans for this moment. Some of them were sabrers, people born on this land, who had spent their entire lives working toward a day they were never entirely sure would come. All of them knew what was about to happen. All of them understood, at some level, that they were standing inside a moment that history would remember long after every person in the room was gone. David Ben-Gurion adjusted his glasses, looked down at the document in front of him, and read, "We hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Israel to be known as the State of Israel." The room erupted. People embraced. People wept. An elderly rabbi fell to his knees. A woman who had survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald and 3 years in a British detention camp in Cyprus stood completely still, with tears running down her face, unable to move, overwhelmed by a feeling that the human body has no adequate architecture for containing. 11 minutes later, the White House issued a statement. The United States recognized the new state. Within hours, the Soviet Union followed. The United Nations, barely 3 years old, still trying to figure out what it was supposed to be, had spent months debating what to do about Palestine. The debate was now irrelevant. The state existed, and within 24 hours, the armies of 5 Arab nations crossed into Israeli territory to destroy it. What followed was a war so desperate, so close-run, so decided by margins of human endurance and improvised military genius and sheer refusal to lose that military historians still study it as one of the most extraordinary national survival stories ever recorded. But the War of 1948 was not the beginning of this story. It was not even close to the beginning. The beginning was half a century earlier, in the drawing rooms and the cramped apartments in the village squares of Eastern Europe, where a people who had been scattered across the world for 2,000 years began, slowly and then with gathering speed, to reach a conclusion that would require them to do something that had never been done in human history: build a country from nothing. Not restore a country, not reconquer a country, build one, from the ground up, in a land that had been continuously inhabited by other people, against the opposition of the reigning empire, against the skepticism of the world's major powers, against the violence of their neighbors, and against the internal divisions of a people who had never been a modern nation and were not entirely sure they agreed on what kind of nation they wanted to be. That story begins not in the Middle East but in Russia, in the Pale of Settlement, the western strip of the Russian Empire where Jews were legally required to live, confined to specific towns and villages, barred from most professions, subject to the periodic organized violence of the pogrom. The word pogrom is Russian. It means devastation. And devastation is what came to Jewish communities in Russia with disturbing regularity in the second half of the 19th century. Organized attacks, sometimes tacitly sanctioned by local authorities, in which Jewish homes and businesses were destroyed and Jewish people were beaten, raped, and killed. The pogroms of 1881 and 1882, triggered by the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, and the conspiracy theories that blamed Jewish involvement, were particularly severe. Entire communities were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Jews fled to Western Europe, to America, and in a smaller but historically crucial stream, to Ottoman Palestine. This first wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine, the first Aliyah as it would be called, using the Hebrew word for ascent, brought roughly 25,000 people to the land between 1882 and 1903. They founded agricultural settlements. They drained swamps. They planted orchards. They built houses in places that had been empty or neglected for decades, on land they purchased legally from Ottoman landlords and absentee Arab landowners. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were settlers in the most literal meaning, people who wanted to settle, to put down roots, to create communities that would give their children a safety that they themselves had never known. But settlement, wherever it happens, is never simply neutral. Other people live where settlers settle. Other people have claims, historical and practical and emotional, to land that settlers are buying and building on. The tension that would eventually produce decades of conflict was embedded in the very beginning of the process, not as a consequence of bad intentions, but as the inevitable friction of two peoples with legitimate connections to the same piece of land. But before the settlers came the idea, and before the idea became practical, it had to be articulated. And the man who articulated it, who took a set of scattered hopes and anxieties and cultural longings and organized them into a coherent political program, was a Viennese journalist named Theodor Herzl. And his story is one of the stranger origin stories in the history of modern politics. Herzl was born in Budapest in 1860, the son of a prosperous Jewish merchant family. He was educated in Vienna, became a journalist, worked as the Paris correspondent for a major Viennese newspaper, and was, in his early 30s, a man who had almost completely assimilated into European secular culture. He was not particularly religious. He spoke no Hebrew. He did not think of himself primarily as a Jew in any politically meaningful sense. He thought of himself as a European intellectual who happened to have been born into a Jewish family. And he believed, as most educated Western European Jews of his era believed, that the solution to the Jewish problem, as it was called, was assimilation. That as Europe modernized and liberalized, as the old religious prejudices of the medieval world gave way to the rational tolerance of the Enlightenment, Jews would simply blend into the broader European society, and the specific vulnerability of being Jewish would gradually disappear. Then, in January 1895, he was sent to cover the degradation ceremony of Alfred Dreyfus. Dreyfus was a French Jewish army officer who had been falsely accused of selling military secrets to Germany. Accused not because the evidence pointed to him, but because he was Jewish, because in the French army of the 1890s, a Jewish officer was automatically suspect, automatically the most convenient available target when a spy needed to be found, and the real spy needed to be protected. The degradation ceremony was a public ritual of military humiliation. Dreyfus was brought before the assembled troops of the Paris garrison. Stripped of his rank insignia and his medals, his sword was broken before him, and he was marched around the parade ground while the crowd outside the gates chanted, "Death to the Jews." Herzl stood in that crowd and listened. He had covered trials and political events and public spectacles of every variety. Nothing had prepared him for the experience of standing in the capital of Enlightenment civilization, the country of Voltaire and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and hearing a mob demand the death of an innocent man, specifically because of his ethnic and religious identity. He went back to his hotel room in Paris, and something in his understanding of the world changed completely and permanently. The assimilation strategy, he concluded, was an illusion. Europe would not absorb the Jews. Europe would not protect the Jews. Europe was, at its structural foundations, a civilization that had been generating anti-Semitism for 15 centuries, and was not going to stop generating it because of the Enlightenment or modernity, or education, or any of the other liberal remedies that people like him had been putting their faith in. The Jews needed a state, their own state, a place where, for the first time in 2,000 years, the physical safety and the political rights of Jewish people would be guaranteed not by the tolerance of a host majority, but by the sovereignty of a Jewish majority. A place where the answer to a pogrom or a degradation ceremony was not an appeal to the conscience of an indifferent government, but the mobilization of a Jewish army and a Jewish police force, and the full institutional machinery of a nation that was, for once, their own. He wrote this argument in a pamphlet called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, published in 1896. He followed it with the novel Alt New Land, Old New Land. He imagined in fictional form what a Jewish state might look like. He organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in August 1897, the first formal gathering of the movement that would bear the name he had not invented, but had transformed from a cultural aspiration into a political program. After the Basel Congress, Herzl wrote in his diary, At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, and certainly in 50, everyone will know it. It took 51 years. He was off by 1. But Herzl did not live to see it. He died in 1904 at 44 of heart failure exacerbated by years of overwork and the constant stress of trying to make the impossible happen through sheer organizational energy. He had spent the years after Basel lobbying every significant political figure in Europe and the Middle East. The German Kaiser, the Ottoman Sultan, the British colonial secretary, the Pope. He got audiences, he got sympathy, he got vague promises and diplomatic ambiguities, and the specific response that powerful people give to supplicants whose cause they find interesting but not urgent. He did not get a state, but he built a movement, and the movement would eventually produce the state, and the state would eventually name its main international airport after him, and his remains would be moved to Jerusalem and buried on a hill that now bears his name. The movement he built had its own internal machinery. Organizations, conferences, newspapers, banks, land purchasing funds that Herzl constructed with the energy of a man who understood that ideas without institutions are fantasies. The Jewish Colonial Trust, founded in 1899, was designed to finance land purchases. The Jewish National Fund, founded in 1901, would buy land and hold it in trust for the Jewish people. The Zionist Congress met every 2 years with delegates from Jewish communities across the world, debating and voting and arguing with the passionate intensity of a people who had spent centuries unable to make any collective political decisions and who were now suddenly overwhelmed by the freedom to do exactly that. The arguments were genuine and they were fierce. The secular Zionists wanted a modern, Western, progressive state. The religious Zionists wanted a state based on Jewish law. The socialist Zionists wanted a workers' cooperative commonwealth. The cultural Zionists, led by the essayist Ahad Ha'am, argued that Palestine should be a spiritual center for world Jewry rather than a state in the conventional political sense, that the project was about cultural renaissance, not national sovereignty. The revisionists, who would eventually coalesce around Ze'ev Jabotinsky, wanted a maximalist state on both sides of the Jordan River, achieved through direct confrontation with the Arabs and the British if necessary. These factions did not agree with each other on almost anything except the basic proposition that something needed to change, and even that agreement had fracture lines running through it in every direction. Herzl navigated this fractious coalition with the diplomatic skill of a man who had been a journalist and knew how to read an audience. He was also running on time. He did not know he was running out of. His heart was failing. The relentless travel, the constant political negotiations, the fundraising, the managing of egos and factions, and the endlessly deferred promise of actual progress, all of it was consuming him at a rate that his constitution could not sustain. He died in July 1904 in Edlach, Austria, at 44 years old, and the movement he left behind was simultaneously his greatest achievement and his unfinished sentence. The movement he built had a specific internal debate that was never quite resolved during his lifetime and that continued, in various forms, for decades after it. Where should the Jewish state be? Herzl himself considered several locations. He had discussions with the British government about Uganda, a territory in East Africa where a significant Jewish settlement might be possible. He never entirely abandoned Palestine, but he was pragmatic enough to consider alternatives when Palestine seemed inaccessible. The mainstream of the Zionist movement rejected this pragmatism furiously. Palestine or nothing, they said. Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, the land of the Hebrew Bible, was the only land that carried the historical and emotional meaning that could motivate a people to attempt the enormous practical challenge of building a nation. Uganda was a geographical solution to what the Zionists saw as a historical and spiritual problem. It was not acceptable. Palestine it was. And Palestine, at the turn of the 20th century, was a dusty, thinly populated province of the Ottoman Empire, governed from Istanbul. administered by Ottoman officials, inhabited by a mix of Arab Muslims, Arab Christians, and a small but growing Jewish minority. The total population was perhaps 500,000 people. The Jewish population was perhaps 25,000. The land that the Zionists wanted to build their state on was not empty. It had never been empty, and the people living there had no particular interest in making room for a European immigrant movement. However historically legitimate the immigrants' connection to the land might be. The Second Aliyah, from 1904 to 1940, brought another 40,000 Jews to Palestine, many of them young, idealistic, socialist in their politics, profoundly serious about the project of building not just Jewish settlements, but a new kind of Jewish person. The pioneering ethos of the Second Aliyah was different from the first. The first Aliyah settlers had, in many cases, hired Arab laborers to work their fields. The Second Aliyah generation was determined to build everything themselves, to create a Jewish working class, to drain the swamps and plow the fields and lay the roads with Jewish hands, to make the physical work of settlement a means of personal and national transformation as much as economic necessity. They founded kibbutzim, communal agricultural settlements that were simultaneously economic enterprises and utopian social experiments. They established trade unions. They set up self-defense organizations. They planted trees. The tree planting deserves more attention than it typically receives, because it is one of the most concrete expressions of the settler's intention. When you plant a forest, you are not planning for yourself. A tree planted in 1910 would not provide shade or fruit for decades. You are planting for your children and your grandchildren. You are making a statement about your permanent intention to be here. The Jewish National Fund, established in 1901, began purchasing land in Palestine and planting trees on it with a systematic thoroughness that was also, unmistakably, a declaration of purpose. By the time the State of Israel was declared in 1948, the JNF had planted millions of trees. The landscape of the country had been physically altered by the intentions of the people building it. The First World War changed everything, not gradually, suddenly in the way that global conflicts change specific regional situations when the imperial powers restructuring the world have specific needs and specific promises to make. In 1917, the British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour sent a letter to Walter Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, which contained a single sentence that would generate controversy, conflict, and legal argument for the next 100 years and counting. The British government, Balfour wrote, viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and would use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration, 67 words that promised, simultaneously, a homeland for one people and the protection of the rights of another, in a territory that both peoples claimed, under the authority of a British Empire that had no clear idea how it was going to manage either promise. The declaration was issued for a specific immediate purpose. Britain needed Jewish support in the United States and Russia, both of which were wavering in their commitment to the war. A public statement of sympathy for Zionist aspirations was a piece of diplomatic maneuvering, as much as a sincere commitment. But it was also a sincere commitment. Balfour himself believed in Zionism, believed that the creation of a Jewish homeland was a morally appropriate response to 2,000 years of persecution. He was not merely calculating. The calculation was the problem, because at the same time that Balfour was making promises to the Zionists, other British officials were making promises to Arab leaders who had helped Britain fight the Ottomans. The Hussein McMahon Correspondence, a series of letters between the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Henry McMahon, and Sharif Hussein of Mecca, contained British commitments to support Arab independence in the territories liberated from Ottoman rule. The Zionists read these promises as excluding Palestine. The Arabs read them as including it. The British, who had been making commitments they did not fully intend to keep to multiple parties simultaneously in the middle of a desperate war, were left with a legacy of contradictory promises that they would spend the next 30 years failing to reconcile. The Ottoman Empire collapsed at the end of the First World War. Britain received the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, the international sanction to govern the territory and prepare it for eventual self-government. The mandate incorporated the Balfour Declaration as a governing principle, which meant that the British were simultaneously required to facilitate Jewish immigration to Palestine and to protect the rights of the Arab majority. These two obligations were not inherently incompatible, but they became increasingly incompatible as Jewish immigration increased, Arab resentment grew, and the British found themselves unable to satisfy either community. The 1920s and 1930s were decades of parallel development in Palestine. The Jewish community, the Yishuv as it was called, built with a purposefulness that, seen from outside, looked almost miraculous. Hospitals, schools, a university, a symphony orchestra, a theater scene, newspapers in Hebrew, trade unions, political parties, agricultural research stations, a proto-army called the Haganah, the beginnings of a civil service, the bones of a state being assembled piece by piece before the state legally existed. Hebrew, which had been a liturgical language used for prayer and study, but not daily conversation, was being revived as a spoken language by a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda, whose obsessive commitment to the project of linguistic revival was one of the more extraordinary single-person achievements in cultural history. He refused to allow any language other than Hebrew to be spoken in his home. His children grew up speaking Hebrew as their first language, the first children in 2,000 years to do so. The 1920s and 1930s were decades of parallel development in Palestine. The Jewish community, the Yishuv as it was called, built with a purposefulness that, seen from outside, looked almost miraculous. Hospitals, schools, a university, a symphony orchestra, a theater scene, newspapers in Hebrew, trade unions, political parties, agricultural research stations, a proto-army called the Haganah, the beginnings of a civil service, the bones of a state being assembled piece by piece before the state legally existed. Hebrew, which had been a liturgical language used for prayer and study, but not daily conversation, was being revived as a spoken language by a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda, whose obsessive commitment to the project of linguistic revival was one of the more extraordinary single-person achievements in cultural history. He refused to allow any language other than Hebrew to be spoken in his home. His children grew up speaking Hebrew as their first language, the first children in 2,000 years to do so. The kibbutz movement deserves particular attention because it was not merely an agricultural arrangement, it was a social revolution. The kibbutz, a collective agricultural settlement in which property was held communally, decisions were made by democratic assembly, children were raised collectively, and the individual's needs were theoretically subordinated to the community's, was the physical expression of the idealistic socialism that animated the second and third Aliyah generations. The early kibbutzim were harsh places. People slept in tents and ate in communal dining halls and worked in fields that were still being cleared of rocks and drained of swamp water. The malaria was constant. The physical labor was brutal. The ideological intensity, the endless meetings and the interminable debates about how to organize this collective enterprise was exhausting in ways that the physical labor sometimes seemed restful by comparison. But they worked, not as pure socialist experiments. The ideological compromises required to function in the real world gradually modified the original utopian vision, but as communities, as frameworks for building social solidarity and cultural identity and the specific quality of belonging that people who had spent their lives as minorities in other people's countries had never quite felt before. The kibbutz produced, over 2 generations, a disproportionate share of Israel's military leadership, its political leadership, its intellectual and artistic output, The children of people who had chosen to work the hardest land with the greatest collective commitment turned out to be exactly the kind of people that a new country, fighting for its survival, most needed. The Arab community was watching all of this and not watching idly. The Palestinian Arab population, organized in families and clans and villages, governed by a complex network of local authorities and religious leaders, and the overarching authority of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, a man of considerable intelligence and considerable ferocity, was increasingly alarmed by the rate of Jewish immigration and the corresponding transformation of the land's demographics and economics. Arab riots broke out in 1920, in 1921, and most severely in 1929, when a dispute over access to the Western Wall in Jerusalem triggered violence across Palestine that killed hundreds of people on both sides. The violence had roots that went deeper than the immediate dispute. It was the expression of a competition between two national movements for the same piece of land, a competition that had no obvious political resolution because the foundational claims of each side were, in their own terms, legitimate. The Jews pointed to 2,000 years of connection to the land, to the Balfour Declaration, to the international sanction of the Mandate, and to the desperate urgency of the Nazi persecution that was already visible on the horizon in 1933, and that would, within a decade, make the need for a safe Jewish state a matter not of historical justice, but of survival. The Arabs pointed to the fact that they were the majority population, that they had been the majority population for centuries, that no people anywhere in the world had ever agreed to transform their homeland into the national project of an immigrant movement, however historically justified the immigrants' claims might be. There was no easy answer. The British tried several. They convened commissions. The Peel Commission of 1937 proposed partition, dividing Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under continued British administration. The Arabs rejected it. A segment of the Zionist leadership accepted it reluctantly, understanding that half a state was better than no state and that the window for any state was closing as the situation in Europe deteriorated. The British then retreated from their own commission's recommendation and issued the White Paper of 1939, which severely restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine precisely at the moment when European Jews most desperately needed somewhere to go. The White Paper of 1939 is a document whose moral dimensions are almost too large to assess. It was issued in May 1939, 4 months after the Kristallnacht pogroms in Germany and Austria had made Nazi intentions toward Jews unmistakably clear, 5 months before Germany invaded Poland and began the process that would kill 6 million people. In this context, the British decision to limit Jewish immigration to Palestine to 15,000 per year for 5 years, knowing that the refugees trying to reach safety were Jews fleeing persecution in Europe, was not merely a political decision. It was, in its consequences, if not its intentions, a death sentence for people who would otherwise have survived. The Yishiv's response to the White Paper was a combination of resistance and pragmatism that tells you something important about the people who were building this country. David Ben-Gurion, who had become the dominant figure in the Yishiv's political leadership, the chairman of the Jewish Agency, the man whose organizational genius was gradually assembling the pre-state institutions into something that could actually function as a government, said that the Yishuv would fight the White Paper as if there were no Hitler, and fight Hitler as if there were no White Paper. Both sentences of that formulation required something almost impossible: the ability to hold two completely contradictory operational realities simultaneously without allowing the contradiction to produce paralysis. The Jewish Brigade fought with the British Army in the Second World War. 30,000 Palestinian Jews enlisted. They fought in North Africa, in Italy, across the European theatre. They also, simultaneously, ran the illegal immigration networks that were attempting to bring Jewish refugees from Europe to Palestine in defiance of the British restriction. They trained the underground military forces that would become the Israel Defense Forces. They built the intelligence and logistical networks that would be essential when the war for independence came. They were, in effect, doing two things at once, contributing to the Allied war effort that was their only chance of defeating Nazism, while preparing for the eventual conflict with the British over Palestine that they considered inevitable. The Holocaust changed everything. The scale of it, 6 million Jews murdered in the most systematic, industrially organized campaign of ethnic extermination ever conducted, could not be, simply a historical event to be recorded and mourned. It was a political argument, made in the most terrible possible way, for the absolute necessity of a Jewish state. Before the Holocaust, the Zionist case was about historical justice and the protection of a persecuted minority. After the Holocaust, it was about basic survival, about the fact that an entire people had just been nearly destroyed in the heart of European civilization, under the governance of one of the most educated and culturally sophisticated nations on earth, and that the lesson of this destruction was that no Jewish community anywhere in the world was safe, so long as its existence depended on the tolerance of its neighbors. The displaced persons camps of post-Holocaust Europe contained, in 1945 and 1946, hundreds of thousands of survivors. They had nowhere to go. Many of their communities had been destroyed. Many of their family members were dead. Many of the countries they had come from were either occupied by the Soviet Union or still permeated with the anti-Semitism that had made the Holocaust possible. There were pogroms in Poland in 1946, more than a year after the war's end, in which returning Jewish survivors were murdered by their Polish neighbors. The survivors in the DP camps had one overwhelming collective desire: to get to Palestine. The British, bound by the White Paper, were preventing them. The images of British naval vessels intercepting ships full of Holocaust survivors and turning them back, or transferring them to detention camps in Cyprus, became one of the defining moral images of the post-war period. A public relations catastrophe for Britain and a recruiting argument for the Zionist underground. In Palestine itself, the situation had deteriorated to the point of open conflict between the Yishuv's underground military organizations and the British authorities. The Haganah, the mainstream defense force, was conducting a careful campaign of armed resistance, while simultaneously running the illegal immigration operations. More radical organizations, the Irgun, led by a Polish-born former revisionist Zionist named Menachem Begin, and the Stern Gang, an even smaller and more extreme group, were conducting direct attacks on British military and administrative targets. The most consequential of these attacks was the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem on July 22, 1946. The King David was the headquarters of the British Military Command and the British Civil Administration in Palestine. The Irgun, under Begin's direction, loaded milk churns with explosives and placed them in the hotel's basement. The warnings that the Irgun later claimed to have given were either not received or not acted upon in time. 91 people died, British, Arab, and Jewish civilians and officials. The bombing horrified the world, horrified large portions of the Yishuv itself, and was condemned by the mainstream Zionist leadership. It also, along with the broader insurgency, contributed to the British conclusion that governing Palestine was costing more than it was worth. In February 1947, the British government announced that it was referring the Palestine question to the United Nations. Britain was exhausted. The country was broke, the empire was dissolving, and Palestine was absorbing resources and political energy that Britain simply could not afford. The UN Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, was formed, toured the region, took testimony from all parties, and produced a recommendation in August 1947. Partition. Again. A Jewish state and an Arab state, side by side, with Jerusalem internationalized under UN administration. The proposed Jewish state would include the coastal plain, the Galilee, and the Negev desert. The Arab state would include the central highlands of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and large parts of the Galilee. The borders were awkward, a map of strategic absurdity in some places, with areas connected by narrow corridors and populations intermixed in ways that made clean separation impossible. But the partition plan was an acknowledgement of reality: two peoples, two national movements, two legitimate claims, one piece of land. The only solution that did not require one of them to be eliminated was division. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on Resolution 181. the partition plan. The vote was 33 in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions. The Jewish community in Palestine and around the world erupted in celebration. The Arab states and the Palestinian Arab leadership rejected the resolution entirely, declaring that they would not accept partition and would use force to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state. The next 6 months were among the most violent in Palestinian history. A civil war began immediately after the UN vote. Arab and Jewish irregular forces fighting across the territory, contesting roads and villages and strategic high points, each side trying to establish facts on the ground before the British mandate expired and the formal states came into existence. The Arab side had the advantage of exterior position. The surrounding Arab states were preparing to intervene militarily. The Jewish side had the advantage of interior lines, a more unified command structure, and, paradoxically, the desperation of a people who knew that defeat meant annihilation. The Haganah's strategic situation in the spring of 1948 was critical. Arab forces controlled many of the roads, Jerusalem was under siege, and isolated Jewish communities in the Negev and the Galilee were cut off from resupply. Ben-Gurion made a decision that most military advisors considered reckless. Instead of consolidating the defensible territories, he launched Plan Dalet, an offensive operation to clear the roads, relieve besieged communities, and establish control over the territory assigned to the Jewish state under the UN partition plan before the Arab armies arrived. Plan Dalet worked at enormous cost. Jewish forces cleared the road to Jerusalem. They secured the Galilee. They fought their way into Haifa, which fell to the Haganah in April, and in the process, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes, a process that the Israelis would call the War of Independence and the Palestinians would call the Nakba, the catastrophe. The refugee question. The hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs who left in 1948, their descendants, who grew up in refugee camps, the claim of return that has been the central Palestinian political demand ever since. This is the wound at the center of the conflict. The consequence of 1948 that no subsequent peace process has succeeded in healing. The balance of forces on May 14, 1948, when Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence, was not as favorable to Israel as the celebration in the streets might have suggested. The Haganah had somewhere between 30 and 40,000 fighters, equipped with whatever weapons could be purchased on the international black market, smuggled past British inspectors or manufactured in clandestine workshops in the Yishuv. They had no air force to speak of. They had almost no artillery. They had limited ammunition, limited food, limited medical supplies. They were fighting on multiple fronts against opponents who had state armies with tanks, artillery, aircraft, and external supply lines. The balance of forces on May 14, 1948, when Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence, was not as favorable to Israel as the celebration in the streets might have suggested. The Haganah had somewhere between 30 and 40,000 fighters, equipped with whatever weapons could be purchased on the international black market, smuggled past British inspectors or manufactured in clandestine workshops in the Yishuv. They had no air force to speak of. They had almost no artillery. They had limited ammunition, limited food, limited medical supplies. They were fighting on multiple fronts against opponents who had state armies with tanks, artillery, aircraft, and external supply lines. But numbers and equipment were not the whole picture. The Haganah had something that the Arab coalition's armies lacked: unity of command and clarity of purpose. The Haganah, about to become the Israel Defense Forces, was fighting for the existence of the state on its own territory. Every commander knew exactly what failure meant. Every soldier understood that there was no fallback position, no reserve homeland to retreat to. The people defending Israel were fighting for everything they had. The people attacking it were, in many cases, fighting for political reasons that were more abstract. And the difference between a man fighting for survival and a man fighting for political objectives is a difference that military historians have noted again and again as decisive in apparently unequal contests. There was also the quality of the leadership. The Haganah's commanders, Yigael Yadin, who served as chief of operations, Yigai Alon, who commanded the Palmach, the elite strike force, Moshe Dayan, who was commanding in the Jerusalem area, and dozens of others who had been training for exactly this moment for years, were some of the most talented military officers of their generation. They were young, most of them were in their late 20s or early 30s. They had grown up in Palestine, knew the terrain with the intimacy of people who had walked and worked every piece of it, and had been preparing for this war. Not in theory, not in military academies, but in actual underground training and in the actual fighting of the preceding months, with a seriousness that their opponents consistently underestimated. The armies that crossed into Israel on May 15, 1948, Egypt from the south, Jordan and Iraq from the east, Syria from the north, Lebanon from the northwest, were, on paper, vastly superior. The Arab League had been promising for months that the Jewish state would be destroyed in its infancy, that the Arab armies would drive the Jews into the sea. It was a promise made with genuine confidence. The military balance, as assessed by outside observers, including American military planners, suggested that the Arab coalition should win. They did not win. The reasons why they did not win are the subject of extensive historical analysis, but several factors stand out. The Arab coalition was not, despite its formal unity, actually a coherent military alliance. The member states had competing interests, conflicting objectives, and no unified command. Egypt wanted to prevent Jordan from expanding its territory. Jordan's King Abdullah was more interested in annexing the West Bank than in destroying Israel. Syria and Iraq were sending forces partly to fight and partly to prevent each other from gaining influence. The Arab armies, individually and collectively, were less well organized, less well equipped, and less motivated than their paper strength suggested. The Israeli forces, meanwhile, were improving rapidly. Arms shipments from Czechoslovakia, the only country willing to sell weapons to the new state, doing so with Soviet tacit approval as part of a strategy of disrupting British influence in the region, arrived through the first weeks of the war and transformed the military balance. Former Jewish soldiers from the British Army and the American and Canadian and South African armies, men with real combat experience, arrived as volunteers. The Haganah transformed itself into the Israel Defense Forces with a speed that shocked professional military observers. Aircraft were assembled and flown by pilots who had never flown over this territory but who learned fast, because learning fast was not optional. The first UN ceasefire, which came in June, gave Israel 4 weeks to regroup, rearm, and reorganize. When the fighting resumed in July, the IDF was a significantly more capable force. It launched Operation Dani, a massive offensive that captured Lydda and Ramel, expelling or causing the flight of tens of thousands of Arab civilians, and securing the road corridor to Jerusalem. It launched Operation Yoav against the Egyptians in the south. By the time the second ceasefire came, the military situation had fundamentally reversed. Israel was not just surviving, it was winning. The final stages of the war were conducted with a tactical ruthlessness that the situation demanded. The Egyptian army was cut off and surrounded in the Fallujah pocket. The Jordanian forces, which had captured the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem in May, a defeat that Ben-Gurion described as the most painful of the war, held the West Bank and East Jerusalem, but were unable to break through to the coastal plain. The Syrian and Iraqi forces were pushed back from the Galilee. The Lebanese did almost nothing. By early 1949, Israel had signed armistice agreements with each of the neighboring Arab states: Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. The armistice lines were not the same as the UN partition plan's proposed borders. Israel controlled more territory than the partition plan had allocated, roughly 78% of the former British mandate, compared to the 56% of the partition plan. The Arab state envisioned by Resolution 181 never came into existence. The West Bank was annexed by Jordan. The Gaza Strip came under Egyptian administration. Jerusalem was divided, the western half Israeli, the eastern half, including the Old City and all the Jewish holy sites, Jordanian. 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were refugees. They were living in hastily constructed camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, camps that were supposed to be temporary and that, 7 decades later, are still there. The refugee crisis was not incidental to the Israeli victory. It was its direct human consequence, and the question of what to do about it. The right of return, the compensation, the acknowledgement of responsibility remains the most intractable element of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to this day. The state that emerged from this war was not the state that Herzl had imagined. It was smaller than the Zionist maximalists had wanted. It was larger than the UN partition plan had prescribed. It was besieged on all sides by neighbors who refused to recognize its existence. It had 700,000 new citizens, Holocaust survivors, immigrants from the DP camps, refugees from Arab countries where the establishment of Israel had triggered violence against Jewish communities that in some cases destroyed communities that had existed for centuries, and it had 800,000 Arab citizens who had not fled or been expelled, and who were now minorities in a Jewish state, living under military administration for the first decade of the country's existence. What came next was the work of building. Ben-Gurion was the central figure of the first decade, the first prime minister, the architect of the state's institutions, the man whose extraordinary combination of organizational genius, political ruthlessness, and genuine historical vision drove the country through the chaos of its birth into something more organized and more durable. He was not a modest man. He knew exactly what he had done and what he intended to do next, and he said so with a directness that made him difficult to like, but impossible to ignore. He had been born in Poland in 1886, had come to Palestine in 1906, had been there through the Ottoman period and the British Mandate and 2 world wars and the Holocaust and the War of Independence, and now he was 72 years old and the prime minister of the country he had spent his life trying to create, and he was not going to let it fail. Ben-Gurion was the central figure of the first decade, the first prime minister, the architect of the state's institutions, the man whose extraordinary combination of organizational genius, political ruthlessness, and genuine historical vision drove the country through the chaos of its birth into something more organized and more durable. He was not a modest man. He knew exactly what he had done and what he intended to do next, and he said so with a directness that made him difficult to like, but impossible to ignore. He had been born in Poland in 1886, had come to Palestine in 1906, had been there through the Ottoman period and the British Mandate and 2 world wars and the Holocaust and the War of Independence, and now he was 72 years old and the prime minister of the country he had spent his life trying to create, and he was not going to let it fail. One of his earliest and most controversial decisions was the dismantling of the separate underground military organizations, the Irgun and the Stern Gang, and their forced incorporation into the unified IDF. The Irgun's commander, Menachem Begin, agreed to the unification after a confrontation that nearly produced a civil war within weeks of the state's founding. In June 1948, an Irgun ship called the Altalena arrived off the Tel Aviv coast, carrying weapons and 3/5 of which Begin intended to keep for Irgun units rather than surrendering to the unified IDF. Ben-Gurion ordered the ship shelled. It caught fire and sank. 16 Irgun members died. Begin, watching from the beach, was reportedly restrained by his associates from going into the sea. He went on national radio and called Ben-Gurion a murderer. Ben-Gurion understood that allowing competing armed organizations to exist within the new state would make the state ungovernable and militarily incoherent. The Altalena affair was brutal and produced a wound in Israeli political culture that took decades to heal. It was also, by any strategic assessment, the right decision. A state that allows multiple armies within its borders is not a state. Ben-Gurion was determined that Israel would be a state. He was equally ruthless about the construction of state institutions. A professional civil service, a national education system, a central bank, a national currency, a judicial system, a national broadcaster, all of these were built in the first years of the state with the speed that only genuine urgency and extraordinary organizational talent could produce. The law of return, passed in 1950, established that any Jew anywhere in the world had the right to immigrate to Israel and receive citizenship. It was not merely symbolic. It was the foundational statement of the state's purpose, the answer to the question of what Israel existed for, expressed in legislation rather than rhetoric. The immigration waves that shaped Israel's first 2 decades were unlike anything any country had absorbed before, in terms of their pace and their diversity, and the specific psychological weight each group carried. The Holocaust survivors who arrived from Europe brought the trauma of what they had experienced and the absolute determination not to be powerless again. The Jews of Iraq and Yemen and Morocco and Egypt and Libya, communities whose presence in those countries predated Islam, whose roots went back centuries or millennia, arrived after being driven out by violence and discrimination that followed the establishment of Israel, stripped of their property and their citizenship, carrying with them the cultural traditions and the resentments and the specific flavors of civilizations that no longer existed for them. The immigrants from different countries spoke different languages, ate different food, had different religious traditions, different political instincts, different ideas about what Israel was supposed to be. Integrating them was one of the most ambitious social engineering projects in modern history, and the word engineering is not used casually. The Israeli state under Ben-Gurion was explicitly interventionist about cultural integration. New immigrants were sent to Ulpans to learn Hebrew, were settled in development towns and agricultural communities across the country, were expected to become Israelis in a specific way. The Mizrahi Jews, those from Middle Eastern and North African countries, found themselves at the bottom of the social hierarchy in which European-born Ashkenazi Jews dominated the political and economic elite. Their own cultural traditions dismissed or marginalized, their children tracked into vocational education while Ashkenazi children were tracked toward university. This discrimination produced resentments that shaped Israeli politics for decades and that only began to be politically redressed when Menachem Begin's Likud party rode Mizrahi disaffection to power in 1977. The economy of the early state was powered partly by German reparations, a transaction of extraordinary moral complexity in which West Germany paid Israel as partial restitution for the Holocaust, and the Israeli political debate over whether to accept this money was one of the most agonizing in the country's early history. Menachem Begin, then in opposition, led demonstrations against the reparations agreement, arguing that no amount of money could compensate for the murder of 6 million people and that accepting it was a moral stain. Ben-Gurion argued that the money was not compensation, it was restitution for stolen property, and refusing it for ideological reasons while Israel's economy was struggling was a luxury the state could not afford. Ben-Gurion won the political argument. The reparations money funded a significant portion of Israel's industrial development in the 1950s. The 1956 Suez Crisis was Israel's first major international strategic adventure, and it revealed both the country's capabilities and the limits of what a small state could achieve without the support of a major power. Egypt's president Gamal Abdel Nasser had been arming his country with Soviet weapons and blockading the Straits of Tiran, the shipping lane through which Israel's southern port of Eilat accessed the Red Sea, in coordination with Britain and France, who had their own reasons for wanting to punish Nasser over his nationalization of the Suez Canal. Israel launched an attack on the Sinai Peninsula in October 1956. The Israeli military performed spectacularly. Sinai was captured in 4 days. The Egyptian army was routed, and then the United States stepped in. Eisenhower, furious at his allies for acting without American approval and threatening to destabilize the Middle East in ways that would benefit the Soviet Union, demanded British, French, and Israeli withdrawal. Israel withdrew from Sinai under American pressure, receiving in exchange an American assurance that freedom of navigation through the Straits of Tiran would be maintained. The Suez episode taught the Israeli leadership several interconnected lessons. Military victory was achievable. The IDF had demonstrated that. Military victory without political backing from a major power was not sustainable. American support was the essential strategic resource, and the special relationship with the United States, which was still developing in the mid-1950s, and which would become the central pillar of Israeli strategy for the next 7 decades, needed to be cultivated with the same care and the same long-term thinking that the founders had brought to every other aspect of building the state. The relationship deepened through the late 1950s and the 1960s. American Jewish communities, galvanized by the Holocaust and the establishment of Israel, built political and financial support networks of extraordinary effectiveness. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, IIPAC, founded in its current form in 1963, became one of the most effective lobbying organizations in Washington. Successive American administrations found political and strategic reasons to strengthen the relationship. The Cold War provided the strategic framework. Israel was a stable, democratic, pro-Western anchor in a region where Soviet influence was growing through relationships with Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. American arms began to flow. American political backing at the United Nations became increasingly reliable. The strategic partnership, formalized in various ways over subsequent decades, became the bedrock of Israeli security policy. June 1967. The Six-Day War. The most stunning military victory in Israeli history and one of the most consequential military events of the 20th century. The context was a crisis that escalated faster than anyone had anticipated. Nasser, under pressure from Arab public opinion and fed misleading intelligence from the Soviets, suggesting that Israel was concentrating forces on the Syrian border, moved Egyptian forces into the Sinai and closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Jordan and Syria mobilized. The Arab world's rhetoric was of imminent war and final victory. Nasser spoke of driving the Jews into the sea with the confidence of a man who believed he was about to do it. In Israel, the mood was close to panic. The country's population was barely 2.5 million. The potential enemies on all sides had armies that, combined, outnumbered the IDF significantly. Reservists were mobilized, and in a country where almost every adult was a reservist, mobilization meant shutting down the economy. The waiting in the weeks between the Egyptian moves and the Israeli decision to strike was psychologically brutal. Survivors of the Holocaust who were now Israeli citizens heard the rhetoric from Cairo and Damascus and felt the specific, visceral terror of people who had already seen what happened when warnings were ignored. The Israeli cabinet debated and decided. On June 5, 1967, at 7:45 in the morning, the Israeli Air Force launched one of the most precisely executed surprise attacks in military history. In 3 hours, 200 aircraft, virtually the entire Israeli Air Force, destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. Aircraft flew at low altitude to avoid radar, attacked from the direction of the Mediterranean rather than across the Sinai, timed their attacks to hit when they knew Egyptian pilots would be at breakfast. Subsequent waves hit the Syrian and Jordanian air forces. By noon on the first day of the war, Israel had air superiority over the entire theater. Without air cover, the Arab army's armor was catastrophically vulnerable. The Egyptian forces in Sinai, cut off and disorganized, were destroyed in 4 days of fighting. Jerusalem, divided since 1948 with the Old City and the Western Wall under Jordanian control, fell to Israeli paratroopers on June 7th. The moment when Israeli soldiers reached the Western Wall, the last remnant of the Second Temple, the holiest, accessible site in Judaism, in Israeli hands for the first time since the Roman destruction of 70 AD, was one of the most emotionally overwhelming moments in the modern Jewish experience. The chief military rabbi, Shlomo Goren, arrived at the wall with a Torah scroll and a shofar, and blew the shofar while soldiers who had been trained to maintain military bearing, in all circumstances, wept openly. The Golan Heights, which Syria had been using to shell Israeli settlements in the Galilee for years, was taken on June 9th and 10th against fierce Syrian resistance. In 6 days, Israel had captured Sinai, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. It had tripled in size. It now controlled the old city of Jerusalem and all the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And it now had a problem that has never been solved. The occupied territories contained more than 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, a population that was neither Israeli citizens nor subjects of any other sovereign state, living under Israeli military administration, their political future undefined. The UN Security Council passed Resolution 242 in November 1967, calling for Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories in exchange for recognition and peace, the famous formula of land for peace. The resolution was deliberately ambiguous about how much land and what kind of peace, and the ambiguity was productive in the short term. It gave all parties a framework they could interpret in ways consistent with their own positions, and destructive in the long term, because it meant that the fundamental questions were left for later resolution, and later turned out to mean decades. The settlement movement, the establishment of Israeli civilian communities in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, began almost immediately after 1967, initially driven by religious nationalist Israelis who believed that the biblical land of Israel, including the West Bank, was an integral part of the Jewish homeland. The settlement project gradually acquired a political constituency that transcended religious nationalism. By the early 2020s, more than 700,000 Israeli settlers lived in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, a fact that most international observers regarded as the single greatest practical obstacle to the two-state solution that UN Resolution 242 had pointed toward. October 1973, the Yom Kippur War, the event that shattered Israeli self-confidence more completely than any previous crisis. On October 6, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, when most Israelis were fasting and synagogues were full, Egypt and Syria launched coordinated surprise attacks across the ceasefire lines from 1967. The Egyptian army crossed the Suez Canal in force, destroying the Israeli fortifications on the East Bank, the Bar-Lev line, which Israeli military planners had believed was essentially impregnable in the first hours of fighting. The Syrian army poured into the Golan Heights with hundreds of tanks, pushing toward the Jordan River and the Israeli heartland beyond it. The opening days were catastrophic. Israeli reservists were called up on Yom Kippur, dragged out of synagogues in prayer shawls. The initial forces sent to stop the Syrian advance in the Golan were overwhelmed. One battalion of Israeli tanks held a pass against hundreds of Syrian armor in fighting that Israeli historians describe as the most desperate defensive battle in the country's history. Israeli aircraft attempting to attack the Arab ground forces were shot down by Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles in numbers that the Air Force had not thought possible. On the southern front, the Egyptian crossing had been so successful that Israeli commanders considered falling back to a line in the middle of the Sinai. For 48 hours, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The defense minister, Moshe Dayan, the famous eye-patch general, the hero of 1967, reportedly told Prime Minister Golda Meir that the Third Temple was fallen. He meant it literally. He meant that Israel might not survive. It survived. The American airlift of weapons, Nixon's decision to resupply Israel despite Arab pressure, and the oil embargo it triggered was critical. The Israeli military recovery was extraordinary. On the northern front, an Israeli counterattack pushed the Syrians back and established Israeli forces on a ridge overlooking Damascus. On the southern front, Ariel Sharon, then a general, later a prime minister, identified a gap between the Egyptian Second and Third Armies and led an armored force through it, crossing the Suez Canal in the other direction and encircling the Egyptian Third Army. The war ended with Israeli forces in positions more advanced than when it started, and with the Egyptian Third Army dependent on Israeli restraint for its survival. But the psychological damage was done. The Yom Kippur War destroyed the myth of Israeli invincibility that 1967 had created. It revealed that the IDF could be surprised, that its intelligence could fail, that its weapons could be outmatched, that the Arab armies had learned from their previous defeats and were capable of genuine military competence. The Agranat Commission, established to investigate the intelligence failure, produced a report that led to the resignation of the Chief of Staff and other senior officers. Golda Meir resigned. The political culture of the country was permanently altered. The certainty and the confidence of the post-1967 era never fully returned. It also, in the specific irony that conflict sometimes produces, created the conditions for the first peace agreement. Anwar Sadat of Egypt, had launched the 1973 war not because he expected to destroy Israel. He was a sophisticated enough strategist to know that was not possible, but because he needed to change the political dynamics. He needed to demonstrate to his own population and to the world that Egypt was not the humiliated loser of 1967, that Egyptian soldiers could fight, that Egypt had leverage. Having demonstrated this, he was in a position to negotiate. The Camp David Accords, brokered by Jimmy Carter in 1978, were the first peace agreement between Israel and an Arab state. Egypt recognized Israel. Israel withdrew from the Sinai. Sadat and Begin shared the Nobel Peace Prize. It was a genuinely historic achievement, and both men paid for it. Sadat was assassinated by Islamic extremists in 1981, killed by men from his own military who regarded the peace as a betrayal. Begin, psychologically devastated by the losses of the Lebanon War in 1982, withdrew into depression and isolation and died in 1992. Making peace with your enemies in the Middle East was, it turned out, more personally dangerous than making war. The Lebanon War of 1982 was the most controversial military operation in Israeli history until the Gaza operations of the 21st century. Begin and Defense Minister Ariel Sharon invaded Lebanon with the stated goal of destroying the PLO's military infrastructure in southern Lebanon, which had been using Lebanon as a base for attacks on northern Israel. The operation expanded far beyond its original stated objectives, eventually becoming a siege of Beirut, the assassination of the Lebanese president, and the Sabra and Shatila massacre, in which Lebanese Christian militias, operating in areas under Israeli military control, killed hundreds of Palestinian civilians in refugee camps, while Israeli forces stood by. An Israeli commission of inquiry found that Sharon bore personal responsibility for not preventing the massacre and recommended his removal from the defense ministry. The Lebanon War produced the first significant Israeli popular protest against a military operation. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis demonstrated in Tel Aviv. The moral clarity that had characterized Israeli public life in its early decades, the sense that Israel's military actions were always defensive, always justified, always the minimum necessary response to existential threat, was replaced by something more complicated and more difficult to navigate. The country that had spent its first decades fighting for survival was now making choices that could not be reduced to survival. It was making choices about the use of power, about the limits of military action, about the relationship between military objectives and civilian lives, that were the moral choices not of a people under threat of annihilation, but of a regional military power with options and responsibilities. The 1990s brought the Oslo Accords, the most significant attempt to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since 1948. Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat shook hands on the White House lawn in September 1993. The PLO recognized Israel. Israel recognized the PLO as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. A process was outlined: incremental withdrawals from Palestinian territories, the establishment of a Palestinian Authority, a negotiated path toward a final status agreement on the hardest issues: borders, Jerusalem, refugees, settlements. Oslo generated the most dangerous enemies on both sides. Religious Israeli nationalists who believed that any territory in the land of Israel was sacred and could not be surrendered. Palestinian rejectionists who believed that any agreement short of full return and full statehood was a betrayal. The Oslo period was punctuated by suicide bombings inside Israel, attacks on buses and markets and discos that killed hundreds of civilians, and by the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which contradicted, in physical reality, the logic of the peace process. On November 4, 1995, Yitzhak Rabin was shot at a peace rally in Tel Aviv by a young Israeli man named Yigal Amir, who believed that religious law required the killing of any leader who gave away Jewish land. Rabin died at the hospital. The assassination was the most traumatic political event in Israeli history since the country's founding. A moment when the internal divisions of Israeli society, the argument over what kind of country this was supposed to be, produced violence directed not outward at enemies but inward, at a leader who represented one answer to that question. The Oslo process limped on. The Camp David summit of 2000, where Clinton brought Barack and Arafat together for final status negotiations, collapsed. Whose fault the collapse was remains one of the most contested questions in the diplomatic history of the conflict. The Second Intifada, 5 years of suicide bombings, Palestinian attacks, and Israeli military operations in the West Bank and Gaza killed more than 3,000 people and hardened positions on both sides in ways that made the political progress of the Oslo years seem, in retrospect, like a moment of temporary optimism rather than a sustainable trajectory. Gaza was evacuated by Sharon in 2005. Every Israeli settler and soldier removed from the territory in a decision that cost Sharon his political career within Likud and led him to found a new party called Kadima. Sharon suffered a massive stroke in January 2006 and never recovered consciousness. Hamas won Palestinian elections in Gaza in 2006, triggering a civil conflict between Hamas and Fatah that ended with Hamas controlling Gaza and Fatah controlling the West Bank, a Palestinian political division that further complicated any path to a coherent peace process. The Israel that exists today is a country of extraordinary contradictions and extraordinary achievements. It has the highest density of startups per capita of any country in the world. Its technology sector, built partly on the military research and development culture of the IDF's intelligence units, and particularly Unit 8200, the Signals Intelligence Corps that has produced an outsized proportion of Israel's most successful technology entrepreneurs, has produced companies and innovations that are deployed globally. In cybersecurity, Israel is a world leader, with companies like Checkpoint and CyberArk, and dozens of others built by veterans of military intelligence units, who brought classified capabilities into the commercial world. In agricultural technology, Israel's drip irrigation systems, developed at the Negev's kibbutz Hatzarim in the 1960s by an engineer named Simcha Blas, have transformed farming in arid environments across the globe. In medical devices, in software, in autonomous vehicles, in water desalination, in the specific disciplines that require the combination of engineering rigor and creative improvisation that the Israeli military and education system produces in abundance. The country has generated commercial achievements that bear no relationship to its size. 9 million people live in a country about the size of New Jersey. They have built universities that rank among the world's best. A Supreme Court that rules against the government with notable regularity. A press that argues with ferocious independence, a parliamentary system in which a dozen parties compete in proportional elections that make governing coalitions extraordinarily difficult to build and maintain. They argue about everything, about religion and state, about the territories, about immigration, about the economy, about national identity, about what kind of country this is supposed to be. The argument is permanent, and the argument is loud, and the argument is conducted in a language that was dead for 2,000 years, and is now a living tongue spoken by millions of people who were born into it. The Eichmann trial of 1961 deserves a moment here, because it was one of the events that most shaped Israeli identity in the first generation. Adolf Eichmann, one of the key organizers of the Holocaust's logistics, the man who had coordinated the deportation of millions of Jews to the death camps, had been living under a false name in Argentina since 1945. Israeli Mossad agents kidnapped him in Buenos Aires in 1960, brought him to Israel, and put him on trial in Jerusalem. The trial was televised. For months, Holocaust survivors testified about what had happened to them, testimony that the generation of Israelis born in Palestine had never heard directly. Testimony about the reality of the camps and the selections and the gas chambers and the silence of the world. A generation of young Israelis who had been raised to see themselves as the new Jew, the fighter, the pioneer, the saber who stood up where the diaspora Jew had allegedly not, heard for the first time the full weight of what had been done to the people who had not made it to Palestine. Eichmann was found guilty and hanged in 1962. It was the only execution in Israel's history. It also solidified the Israeli national consciousness around the lesson that has been the most constant driver of the country's security doctrine ever since: never again. Not as a slogan, not as a political talking point, as a genuine strategic principle that has shaped military doctrine, nuclear strategy, foreign policy, and the willingness to use preemptive force in ways that regularly put Israel in conflict with international norms. Never again meant that Israel would maintain the military capability to defend itself by itself, that it would never depend on others for its survival, that it would strike first rather than absorb a blow that it believed was coming. This doctrine has been the source of Israel's greatest strategic successes and some of its most contested decisions. The country has absorbed more than 3 million immigrants since its founding, from the Soviet Union after its collapse, from Ethiopia in 2 dramatic airlifts, from Argentina and France and dozens of other countries where Jewish communities decided that the uncertain safety of the diaspora was less desirable than the complicated reality of the Jewish state. It has built, from the scratch of a UN partition plan and a 37-word declaration, a functioning democracy with an independent judiciary, a free press, Arab parties in the Knesset, a Supreme Court that regularly rules against government actions, and a society that argues loudly about everything and reaches uncomfortable consensus on very little except the fundamental necessity of the country's existence. This last point is the one that the founders, Herzl in Vienna, Ben-Gurion in Plonsk, all the men and women who came to Palestine in the Aliyot, and drained the swamps and built the kibbutzim, and fought the wars and sat in the provisional government that approved the Declaration of Independence. This is the point they were arguing for all along, not that Israel would be perfect, not that it would be free of internal conflict or external threat, or the moral complications that power inevitably produces, not that every choice it made would be right, or that every life lost in its defense would be the minimum necessary, only that it would exist, that the people who had been scattered and persecuted and gassed and burned would have a place that was theirs, a place where the political authority was their own, where the army was their own, where the decision of who could enter and who could stay was their own, where a person could be Jewish not as a guest of a tolerating majority, but as a citizen of a sovereign state. Herzl said it would take 50 years. He was 1 year off. The man who wrote those words in his diary in Basel in 1897 did not live to see the state he had founded. He was buried in Vienna. In 1949, his remains were brought to Jerusalem and buried on the hill that bears his name, looking out over the city that had been the center of Jewish longing for 2,000 years. It is a long way from a diary entry to a burial on a hilltop in Jerusalem. It is an even longer way from the Pale of Settlement in Russia to the towers of Tel Aviv, from the pogroms of 1881 to the Declaration of 1948, from 2,000 years of statelessness to a country that sends astronauts to the International Space Station and wins Olympic medals and argues with itself every day in a parliament conducted in a language that was dead for 2,000 years and is now spoken by 9 million people. That distance, the specific, extraordinary, improbable, costly, contested, and genuinely remarkable distance between where the story started and where it is now, is the rise of Israel. It is not finished. It was never going to be finished. End of script. The Soviet Jewish immigration of the 1990s, known as the Big Aliyah, over 1 million people arriving in Israel between 1990 and 2000, was the most dramatic single transformation of Israeli society since the state's founding. The Soviet Union had for decades denied its Jewish population the right to emigrate. Soviet Jews had been trapped, unable to practice their religion or their culture openly, unable to leave, cut off from the Jewish world outside the Iron Curtain. When Gorbachev's reforms opened the gates, they came. 1 million people in a decade. An increase of 20% in Israel's population in 10 years. Engineers, doctors, musicians, mathematicians, scientists, teachers. A highly educated population that transformed Israel's human capital base almost overnight, contributing disproportionately to the technology sector that would, in the 1990s and 2000s, turn Israel into one of the world's great innovation economies. The Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel community, a Jewish community whose existence in the Ethiopian highlands dated back centuries, and whose isolation from the Jewish mainstream had produced a form of Judaism that scholars found fascinating and that the Israeli rabbinate found theologically complex, were brought to Israel in two major operations. Operation Moses in 1984 and Operation Solomon in 1991 together brought more than 40,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel in airlifts that were conducted with the urgency of people rescuing a community from imminent danger, because that is exactly what they were. The integration of Ethiopian Jews into Israeli society was difficult and incomplete in ways that are still being addressed. Discrimination, economic marginalization, the specific challenge of absorbing a community whose entire cultural framework was radically different from the European and Middle Eastern communities that had defined Israeli society until that point. These communities, Russian, Ethiopian, Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, secular, religious, Arab, Druze, Bedouin, are all Israeli. They argue about what that means constantly. They argue in the Knesset and in the courts and in the press and on social media and at the Friday night Shabbat table and in the army, where 20-year-olds from all of these communities serve together and learn, sometimes brutally, the meaning of a society that insists on common obligation. The army is worth discussing separately because it is, more than any other institution, the crucible in which Israeli identity is formed and reformed continuously. Every Jewish Israeli citizen and many non-Jewish ones serves. Men serve for 3 years, women for 2. After mandatory service, reservists are called up regularly, sometimes for weeks at a time, sometimes for longer during conflicts, until their late 40s. This means that in Israel the experience of military service is not an abstraction or a political question. It is something that happens to you personally and then continues to happen to you at regular intervals throughout your adult life. It means that the decisions the government makes about when and how to use force are decisions that every Israeli citizen has personal skin in, not as a taxpayer worried about budget allocations, but as a person who may personally be called up to implement those decisions. This creates a political culture around military affairs that is both more informed and more fraught than in countries with professional standing armies. Israeli citizens argue about military strategy with a specificity and a personal investment that Western observers sometimes find striking. They have opinions about rules of engagement and operational doctrine and the strategic wisdom of particular military campaigns, and their opinions are grounded in personal experience in ways that make the debate substantive rather than abstract. The casualty figures from wars and operations are not statistics to Israeli audiences. They are neighbors, friends, the sons and daughters of people you know. The peace process, the settlements, the occupation, the two-state solution. These are topics on which Israeli society is as divided as any democracy has ever been divided, with genuine disagreements that cut across religious, ethnic, generational, and class lines in patterns that no simple political taxonomy can capture. There are Israelis who believe that peace with the Palestinians is the most urgent priority and that the settlement enterprise is a catastrophic strategic mistake. There are Israelis who believe that no viable Palestinian partner for peace currently exists, and that unilateral withdrawal from the West Bank would produce a Hamas-controlled state on Israel's eastern border that would make the security situation dramatically worse. There are Israelis who believe in a one-state solution in various configurations. There are Israelis who have simply stopped believing that a solution is achievable in their lifetime and are focused on managing the conflict rather than resolving it. All of these positions have people of intelligence and good faith arguing for them. All of them contain elements that are recognizably true and elements that are recognizably incomplete. The conflict is genuinely hard in the specific sense of a problem, where the foundational claims of the parties are not fabricated or illegitimate, but are real, and where making one set of legitimate claims fully whole requires compromising another set of legitimate claims in ways that neither party has yet been willing to accept. What has not changed, and what seems unlikely to change regardless of how the political questions are eventually resolved, is the fundamental reality of Israel's existence. The state is there. The 9 million people who live in it are there. The economy, the army, the universities, the cities, the argument that never stops. All of it is there, on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, in a strip of land about the size of New Jersey, built in 3 generations out of a diaspora dream, and an enormous collective act of will. Herzl sat in Vienna in 1896 and wrote a pamphlet arguing that the Jews needed a state. He had been to a degradation ceremony in Paris. He had seen what happened to a people without a country. He had understood something that most of his contemporaries were not yet ready to understand, that the safety of a minority is always contingent on the goodwill of the majority, and that goodwill is not a reliable foundation for the survival of a people. He died 8 years later, having built a movement but not a state, having pointed in a direction but not arrived there. The people who arrived there did it through a combination of historical circumstance, terrible suffering, extraordinary determination, and the specific quality of a people who had been told for 2,000 years that this land was theirs and had never quite stopped believing it. Whether the result, the state that exists today, with all its achievements and all its contradictions and all its unresolved conflicts, is the full realization of what Herzl imagined, or a complicated partial achievement of something that is still being built, is a question that the next generation of Israelis will have to answer through their choices in a way that this script cannot determine for them. What can be said with certainty is this: the rise of Israel is one of the most consequential stories in modern history. A people dispersed across the world for 2 millennia, a modern political movement born in the drawing rooms of Vienna and the villages of Russia, waves of immigrants building settlements in a land already inhabited, 2 world wars, a genocide, a declaration read in a museum hall in Tel Aviv on an afternoon in May. 5 armies crossing the border, a war survived, a state built, a language revived, a desert made to bloom. That story happened. It is still happening. And the world it happened in is different, permanently, irreversibly, consequentially different, because it did.